Gary Winship is an associate professor in the education section of the University of Nottingham. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for Mental Health, and I have great pleasure in welcoming him to talk to us today about the recovery movement and how it relates to therapy and thesis. So please welcome Gary Winship.
Thanks very much, Steve. I hope this paper is helpful. I've been working on it for several months now since Sarah first suggested that we ought to get to grips with the recovery movement. So that's the aim of this paper today. So, of course, TCs did not invent recovery, but there's a good case to be made that TCs have involved some exacting methods of socially inclusive cooperative therapy, which are the vanguard of achievements in the progress towards efficacious humanitarian intervention in the field of mental health. However, TCs once upon a time could lay claim to special ownership of the means and production of how to do recovery, especially when it comes to user involvement, then the advent of the new recovery movement has brought something new to the table. So I want to take a closer look this morning at the new recovery movement to see how it maps and lines up with TC practice, whether it represents a threat or an opportunity for TCs. The new recovery paradigm has more lately been favoured by politicians and commissioners alike and has been positioned in a number of key policy documents. I'm sure some of you will be very familiar with them. And perhaps best summed up in The Journey to Recovery, which was published in 2001. Services of the Future will talk as much about recovery as they do about symptoms and illness. The mental health system must support people in the settings of their own choosing, enable access to community resources, including housing, education, work and friendships, or whatever they think is crucial to their own recovery. So the new recovery movement is having a sort of heyday, I think, that was once enjoyed by social psychiatry, TCs, psychoanalysis, CBT. But of course, recovery is hardly a new concept. Even those within the recovery movement, Glen Roberts and Jed Boardman, point to ideas such as kindness, hope and respect, being as kind of old age concepts that were embedded as far back as Samuel Tuke's work at the York Retreat. But in building a theory of new recovery, those who are writing the story of new recovery seem to have made no attempt to track how these ideas, of which social inclusion, cooperative peer relations, user empowerment and so on, have evolved in the field of mental health and psychiatry. Of course, many of these key ideas of new recovery, such as challenging the boundaries of peer involvement, mobilising the collective resources of the communities, and challenging the role of the expert, flattened hierarchies and so on, have been well worked out in TC history. One might well have expected that the recovery colleagues would have used therapeutic community, history and practice as a sort of go-to source for anchoring a sort of template for the new recovery movement, but it's not happened. When we look at the accounts of the emergence of new recovery over the last 10 years, one might justifiably feel that therapeutic community practice and research has been written out of history. Some colleagues in the TC fraternity, Rowdy Yates a couple of years ago, sort of offered a laurel leaf of bridge building to the new recovery movement, arguing that there would be mutual benefit for TCs and recovery to learn from each other. But so far, such offerings seem to have come to naught. This wouldn't be the first time that therapeutic communities have been overlooked. Colleagues in the TC family might well feel somewhat abnegated as the new recovery story has evolved. The new recovery colleagues have stated they believe the recovery approach will be a major game changer. A bold assertion that it's going to be as significant as the closure of asylums. The principles of recovery are now central to mental health in England as well as the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Recovery represents the next big transformational change for mental health services in this country, on a par with the closure of asylums and the move to community care. I mean, these are bold assertions that seek to write a new chapter in the history of tackling mental illness. But it's not just in the history of ideas that the recovery approach has sort of colonised space, because more lately the new recovery movement has become a strategized, significant actor in terms of attracting financial resources and reshaping services. The Department of Health Commission Strategy Group Implementing Recovery Through Organisational Change was established in February 2011, and in its first 18 months worked with 29 NHS organisations to help them refocus their services around the principles of recovery using a list of 10 key indicators. And central to the development of the new recovery movement has been the development of recovery colleges. There are now, I think, more than a dozen recovery colleges which offer a variety of education courses ranging from one-day introductions to such things like living with bipolar disorders to skills-based and employment courses elsewhere. So it's quite a variety of programs. IMROC has more lately established learning set packages which offer resources to colleagues who want to develop recovery services and recovery colleges. I don't know whether I've got the price of the... Yes, just Sarah's question about value for money. I thought it'd be interesting to have a look at what IMROC are charging. I don't know how that maps. That seems like a lot of money, doesn't it? For not a great deal. The overarching aim of the education process in recovery colleges is to enable people to develop their own recovery plans. We can see from table 1 here how this recovery concept is matched to a therapeutic approach. This is taken from a briefing document about recovery colleges. So the educational approach versus the therapeutic approach. I'll just let you have a quick read of that. And I've got another table here, so that's one way that there's a distinction made between therapy and education. And so here's another table from the same document, which is how the recovery approach is contrasted in terms of the setting itself. So the idea of shifting from a day centre down this side to a recovery college or an educational paradigm, if you like. I'm sure anybody having a look at this would, be able to sort of pick out all sorts of areas for critical debate. Interestingly, I did say to Steve I wasn't going to plug any of my own stuff today, but just while I have the chance, there's a book I published with Jonathan Pedder's papers a couple of years ago. In 1977, he was talking about graduation as the end point of psychotherapy. So it's hardly a new idea to use the term graduation. So the idea of transforming the role of client to student is indeed a radical proposition, and it may even have some merits. However, the binary descriptions in the table are at best oversimplified, and at worst they're inaccurate and misleading, I think. But this sort of polemical positioning is not uncommon when a new movement carves out its own identity and niche. Elsewhere in the recovery discourse, there is an element of zeal where authors talk about acknowledging pioneers and so forth. And we might accept this enthusiastic rhetoric and bluster on a more sober reflection, we have to say that these ideas have not been tested independently, and the claim from recovery movement colleagues that they have strong evidence of efficacy is more fanfare than fact, because all that exists at present is feedback for some of the programme participants. But fanfare there is, so I think we do well to think about this new recovery movement and where it maps onto the mental health landscape. We might ask if there are some ways forward for TCs in articulating, adapting and developing recovery-facing services. Indeed, there are already some TCs that are starting to use the language, such as the Haven Project in Colchester, where they've been talking about the concept they call transitional recovery, which frames stages in the recovery journey and makes explicit that recovery is not an endpoint, but rather a series of steps towards well-being. And the retreat in York, just a few days ago, officially opened its new recovery college there. So there may be some potential points for collaboration with colleagues at Acorn House. I know we've got some colleagues from Acorn House here. I'd be interested to hear their thoughts about the New Recovery College there. So defining New Recovery. I should clarify at this point that the term New Recovery I've coined for the purpose of debate here, because colleagues in the recovery movement simply refer to the approach with the catch-all term recovery. But I think we should keep in mind that this new recovery approach is a specific addition to other well-established traditions in recovery. For instance, recovery in the field of addictions and substance misuse dates back to the 1950s and has been a backbone of organisations such as AA and NA. And there are a whole raft of programs, recovery programs in substance misuse, concept houses, 12-step Minnesota models, as well as a large network of correctional institutions in the US closely allied to milieu therapy and TC practice. Another new type of recovery comes under the rubric of a mutual recovery program, which has been led by our own Nick Manning and colleagues at the University of Nottingham, which has been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council to the tune of 1.5 million. The mutual recovery program, while owing some of its impetus to the new recovery paradigm, is distinguished by the fact that at the heart of mutual recovery is an arts process as opposed to an education process. The array of arts-based interventions for the mutual recovery program includes music, clay. I've been leading on a project looking at clay as a facet of therapy, creative writing, and the interventions are led by artists and practitioners, but not therapists per se. In an offshoot from the mutual recovery program, there's some innovative workshops that we've been doing in Nottingham based on creative activities such as drumming, capoeira, music and comedy workshops. These are currently clustered together under the wing of Performance Arts Research Group, which I'm convening at the Institute of Mental Health. And we have 2 doctoral students working on evaluations of these programs. The comedy workshops have been really very interesting. And the program involves people in recovery who work with a professional comedian over a period of 4 weeks. During the workshops, the clients share their own story, see if there are elements of their experiences which might come together as material for a routine. For those that have gained enough confidence through the program, they perform their set on a showcase evening on the final week of the program. Elements of peer support, mutual cooperation during the program start to resemble sort of group and therapeutic community practice as the clients tell their story. A sort of funding of mutual support that builds up a new network for the clients. That's the aim. I've been to a few of the showcase evenings, and the performances are very poignant and moving and also very funny. And the program has been receiving some good support from elsewhere. There was a fundraiser in Nottingham last September, which Harry Hill and several colleagues came up and did a free evening at the concert hall. And recently, Phil Jupitus came to a final evening showcase, listened to the client's sets, performed a 40-minute set of his own, and didn't charge a penny, which was just fantastic. So the final arena for recovery is what we might consider in more general terms a model of health recovery, which covers an array of recovery-facing services which were established in the traditions of psychiatric and mental health services. Interestingly, I was thinking about the prison services as well, which you might be across different programs. Social rehabilitation, occupational therapies, psychological interventions which are geared towards recovery and informed by literature and research generally dedicated to the principle of mental health recovery. Social psychiatry, rehabilitation, and of course therapeutic communities. Taken together, these domains of recovery might be identified as a quadrant that might usefully be a provisional map for thinking about a theory or a model of meta-recovery. That is to say, we should think of a meta-system or a meta-model of recovery that can be described in terms of a variety of approaches, but each with the same desired outcomes. but different methods. Some people might say that the distinction is superfluous, but for the sake of clients, politicians and commissioners, I think it's important that new recovery is seen as one arc of recovery rather than the thing itself. Because if it's not already apparent to you, I think the means of looking across different types of recovery, there needs to be a fit between the recovery model and clients' needs. And certainly new recovery is not a method that fits well to all clients. Indeed, I'm not entirely sure that it represents a sort of majority paradigm. So where are the points of convergence between recovery, TCs and new recovery? One of the key assets of the new recovery movement is the authoritative voice of leaders who are experts by experience. Indeed, along the way of recovery, there appears to be a growing list of charismatic figures who have, by virtue of their own recovery, made careers out of their ensuing endeavour to articulate their own story. The best known of these is Pat Deegan, an American who was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager, who then recovered and then trained as a psychologist, becoming an activist in disability rights, and then an advocate of her own brand of recovery. Deegan published a clutch of papers in the early 1990s about the process of recovery, with ideas about hope, optimism, which argued that recovery was a journey rather than an outcome. She's a highly successful teacher, speaker, trainer, consultant, and business entrepreneur. And Deegan began to attract followers in the USA and then later in the UK, arguing that the goal of recovery was not to become normal, but rather to embrace the human vocation of becoming more fully human. Some of those at the forefront of the recovery movement in the UK have perhaps mirrors Pat Deegan's own story. For example, Rufus May, now a psychologist in Bradford, has had his own experience of psychosis when he was 18. Rufus is best known for the documentary The Doctor Who Hears Voices, which was screened on Channel 4. If you've heard Rufus speak at conferences, you'll know that he's entertaining, he's funny, and poignant when he's talking about his story. But Rufus is also adamant that all psychiatric hospitals should be closed, and he's got some rather unconventional ideas about how to approach working with people who are psychotic and hearing voices. And he engages in a sort of dialogue process of hearing voices. There's a YouTube, if you Google him and have a look on YouTube, there's a video of Rufus dressed up as Tigger running a workshop. Both Julie Repper and Rachel Perkins have also become key figures synonymous with the new recovery approach and are both part of the steering group for IMROC. Julie and Rachel have, like Pat Deegan and Rufus, been open about their own mental health difficulties over the years. Their book, Social Inclusion and Recovery, set out their ideas around recovery and social inclusion, highlighting the role of staff in holding a position of vision and inspiration. Here's their list of 10 dimensions of hope, inspiring relationships, valuing people as human beings, acceptance and understanding, believing in the person's ability and potential, attending to people's priorities and interests, accepting failures and setbacks as part of the recovery process, accepting that the future is uncertain, finding ways of sustaining our own hope and guarding against despair, accepting that we must learn and benefit from experience. It's impossible to argue with those sentiments. For Julie and Rachel, the recovery model becomes a sort of solution-focused based approach that includes strategies for facilitating access, befriending, health information, social skills, life skills, and so forth. It's got a strong sort of Rogerian underpinning of unconditional positive regard for clients. Their approach assumes a sort of level of amenability of clients who are presupposed to be motivated to become engaged in programs leading to social inclusion. And finally, just to round up my brief sort of who's who, if you like, of new recovery, there's Glen Roberts, who's the Royal College of Psychiatrists lead on recovery since 2005, and he's also on the IMROC steering group. On the website, Glen describes himself as someone who has personal and family experiences of depression and working on his own recovery over a lifetime. So, a critical review of new recovery and where it maps onto TC practice. How am I doing for time?
20 minutes.
Okay. Like the therapeutic community movement, the recovery movement has its roots in the vision of a number of charismatic leaders. Perhaps one of the differences between the TC movement and the recovery movement is that the recovery has made a bigger deal about leaders being people who have been in recovery. Indeed, being in recovery is not quite requisite to leadership in the new recovery movement, but it plays a vital role. The recovery movement emerged in tandem with a sort of era, I think, in mental health recently, which saw a revitalised acknowledgement of the reality that many practitioners were indeed wounded healers. Mike Shooter, who was the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, I think it was 1998 to 2005, went public about his own depression that had taken him to the brink of suicide at one point in his life. And Phil Bernard, one of the leading professors of mental health nursing in the UK, likewise went public about his depression. So there might be some pause for thought, because many therapeutic community practitioners have themselves been in therapy as part of their training and may indeed have had illnesses themselves in their lifetime. Therapy has perhaps been more of a necessity than a training requirement sometimes, but nonetheless, it's certainly one of the strengths of the TC movement that it has a sort of inbuilt role in the principle of co-construction of theories of mental illness and recovery, with an increasing role of clients involved in research and education. When it comes to, I think, sort of personal stories of recovery and breakdown, members of the TC fraternity perhaps have been much less public about their own mental health issues. When I began working at the Bethlehem and Maudsley Hospital in 1980, the closure of the Charles Hood Unit, TC, ostensibly as the result of a breakdown of the lead psychiatrist Bob Hobson, was only ever talked about hushedly. Likewise, rumours of Julian Goodburn's breakdown at Paddington and R.D. Lang's own foibles were subject to derision by colleagues who were rather, I think, sort of anti-psychoanalysis and therefore anti-TCs. There was something of a minor sea change, perhaps, for us in TCs when Kevin Healy, who was at the time the chair of the ATC, announced at a steering group that he'd been off work because of depression and not because, as there were some rumours, for any other reason. Of course, there are other personal struggles and stories that people have, that communities have, that tells the story of TCs. It would seem important to acknowledge that the idea of experts by experience is not the sole preserve of new recovery. One of the features of the new recovery approach is it's been carved out to some extent from a rather individualistic tendencies of social entrepreneurialism. And Pat Deegan's work in the US is largely a private industry. And although more lately recovery has been moulded into the NHS here in the UK, there can be no doubt that the recovery method seeks to diminish state intervention. That is to say, professional input is replaced by peer-facing workforces. The aim explicitly is to reduce costs and is therefore welcomed by those who have budgets to manage. New recovery commentators tell us that they are setting out to challenge what they perceive to be the pessimism of other traditional approaches, and the focus is on resilience rather than vulnerability. And that this inclination is therefore positively focused on the resources that people have at their disposal. It's described as an assets-based approach. We might think of recovery then, with its lean cost-effectiveness, or at least that's its aim, as a paradigm fit for austerity. But on the other hand, we might wonder whether this canny commodification of health and welfare under the rubric of social capital is another unnerving example of the unabashed march of capitalism into the territory of the public sphere. The new recovery movement dismisses state health expertise, dismisses professionals, and hammers a nail into the disappearing ideal that health professionals should be equally and freely available to the help of many. We might say that the concept of recovery has been appropriated as a justification for evolving cheaper mental health services. But it's unreasonably expected to fill the gaps where professionals, health intervention and state intervention should exist. But the idea of cost efficiency isn't something that's an anathema to therapeutic communities. In many ways, TCs have led the way in privileging the role of client and therein diminishing the role of professionals. Maxwell Jones was criticised for hiring social therapists, but it was an ingredient of cost efficiency. So I think there needs to be some closer scrutiny of the new recovery approach and its claims to cost efficiency compared to other approaches. It's not proven. And there's something also about the sort of absence of a kind of political agenda for new recovery. We need to think about the politics of entrepreneurialism, which envisions this small state approach. This stands in opposition, I think, to some of the ideas constructed through TCs committed to cooperative efforts which seek to engage with the concept of hierarchy in order to diminish it. It can be seen rooted in the ideologies of collectivist-facing theories. While the recovery approach has been strong on the rhetoric of service involvement, TCs have adapted and developed and put the principles into action in the deployment of formal democratic structures and quality checks, including service, audit and review. Perhaps the most significant difference between the new recovery approach and the way TCs might be considered is what I've come to think about in terms of a soft recovery versus hard recovery. I'm not entirely sure that the concepts of soft and hard recovery are fit for purpose, but let's see. New recovery begins with the idea, a presupposition of client cooperation. TCs seem more equipped to work with clients who are more reluctant to engage. For many clients, the first challenge is that of establishing a level of engagement beginning with a client in a state of retreat. The nature of intense resistance to the best of therapeutic intentions is familiar. TCs and new recovery entirely agree that peer support is essential in building resilience, but I would say that TCs begin with the notion that social inclusion is not a given. Social isolation lies at the root of many mental health problems, and there are any number of steps which precede a client being able to be engaged with their peers. TCs are particularly helpful when it comes to helping clients work through the resistance to engage with conflict, and this seems to be rather remote in the new recovery model. I think this willingness to engage with the dynamics of conflict would be characteristic of a sort of hard or tough approach. TCs can sometimes get a reputation of being harsh and challenging places to clients, and I think clients can initially find the experience unsettling and challenging. I have a brief illustrative extract here from Janelle Clark's doctoral research, which has been supervised by Nick Manning, and more lately I've been a second supervisor. Janelle has undertaken extensive and in-depth observations of 2 therapeutic communities in order to look at what are the factors of change. And in this brief extract, the client Anna, who is new to the community, is talking to Janelle about an experience of being in a community group. So Anna is a new client, and in the group there's been another client who's been distressed. So this Anna says to Janelle, and then we sit in this meeting and we're asking her all these questions, and I don't know. I kind of just wanted to say to her, just leave the fuck alone. She can't think straight. What are you doing? You're asking these people really important questions when they're not in a place where they can answer it. And I don't know, there's something really about it struck me as cruel in a way. But within 10 minutes, she was sat in the bay of the window with her headphones on, still upset, but contained and able to be safe. And I just thought, God, this is really weird. Because all through the meeting, I was just thinking, what the hell? And then you're like, oh, I don't really get it. But it does seem to work somehow. And that was really strange. I really connected with her right from the off. And I think that was a sense, nobody can help me. I think that's what I got from her, the fact that she couldn't imagine there would be anybody who could help. A colleague, Brian Brown, who's at De Montfort, who we refer to as Brown, he's dropped his first name, but Brown of Leicester, he wrote to me recently and said that he thought of TCs as a sort of model of haranguing patients. Perhaps Anna, in the vignette above, might well have thought the same thing initially, but then she came to see that compassion can take many forms, and in this case, the client who was distressed experienced a kind of compassion from, I think, a sort of tough compassion, if you like. The haranguing reputation for TCs might hint to be one of the distinctive therapeutic imperatives of TC recovery approaches, which is the idea of reality confrontation, which was an idea coined by Rappaport on his observation work at the Henderson. In days gone by, there might have been some element of therapeutic haranguing. I remember visiting places like Phoenix House and Alpha House, Promise in Canterbury in the 80s, and there were other TC services that were around this sort of model of concept houses that Griffith Edwards had set up in the 60s. And this idea of sort of tough love, and these programs were still doing things in the 80s like sort of mirror therapy, where a client was expected to sit down in front of a mirror for several hours and look at themselves, or marathon large groups. So there was something, I think, perhaps tougher in the climate in the 80s. But reality confrontation has never been a soft option. I think these days there's more of a preference for the kind of quintessentials that Rex talks about in his 5 quintessences of therapeutic communities. But the idea of reality confrontation has never been ditched, I don't think. And I think it's an idea that could be more unpicked. I know Simon Clark is going to be saying a bit more about reality confrontation with his story later today. One might trace this sort of tougher edge of TCs back to the roots in the army, experiments in Mill Hill, Northfield and Staffordshire. But reality confrontation as a therapeutic endeavour suggests somehow that the client needs a reality. It might seem like a pejorative notion. Some people might say that clients need protecting from reality. To some extent, that would concur with what Bion argues, that people are plunged into depression and psychosis as a way of retreating from reality. That is to say, the real world is too painful and distressing, and some people, vulnerable people, might retreat into a depression or a psychosis in order to find, ways of coping with the reality. So recovery, therefore, does involve a return of reality. And perhaps on this point, new recovery and TCs do overlap, insofar as new recovery is interested and ambitious about clients having the aptitude for work and social integration. But I think it needs to be stressed that reality confrontation is not always a big dose of reality. And in TCs, it's a kind of stepped procedure, and that it's more staggered, perhaps. The model of reality confrontation is more like Winnicott's idea of the real world in small doses. In TCs, new clients have much less responsibility than the more senior members who have been in treatment longer. This public image of TCs as a tough recovery choice has perhaps not played out well over time, and perhaps there could be some more clear articulation of the way in which reality confrontation is a staged process with strong built-in elements of induction. So just to finish off, there may be something familiar in the way in which the new recovery movement has taken off. Indeed, if we look back at the history of TCs, we can see how TCs went from movement to method and then later to a set of maxims with the onset of monitoring, measurement and critique. That journey for TCs from movement to method to maxim took 70-odd years. The stellar rise of the new recovery movement has happened within less than a decade. Now, you might say this is just a sort of impressive rise, or you might think of it as a sort of petulant sprint of plagiarism built on the faulty stilts of charismatic leaders, which will see the idea just whittle away as quickly as it has blossomed. But we'll see. I do think family trees are essential, and as I say, it does seem to me that the new recovery movement has sort of sees itself as a sort of immaculate conception. It's given birth to itself. It doesn't owe its existence to forebearers, and that's what I think we have in therapeutic communities. Family trees are essential to root oneself in the present and set a tenure for the future. And here, therapeutic communities, at the behest perhaps of psychoanalysis, have done rather well in mapping and archiving progress. And our friends at PET and Craig continue to be an absolutely valuable source for this process. The TC movement has long since understood the precariousness of charismatic leaders and has instead, in recent years, focused more squarely on proof of concept. But nonetheless, the TC movement has a long distinguished role of honour, and I've tried to capture a few here. Rex complained last time because his picture wasn't big enough, but I've made him a big picture in the corner. I have managed to find a picture of Steve. Craig tells me that's one of his favourite pictures there. I don't know whether we should have a poster from PET. Oh, that's not the one. Oh, okay. But if anybody else wants to have their picture, by all means send it in. I'm sure there's lots of people that I've missed there, but I think that's Barbara Docker Drysdale at the top, and a rather blurry picture of Kevin, the late Stuart Whiteley, and others. Cleo Sakaris, who's a PhD student with Nick and myself, is currently doing a really interesting piece of work that's sort of mapping together a global account of the TC movement, and we'll be coming up with a sort of who's who of therapeutic communities, which will make for fascinating reading. So there may be some inclusion criteria for your picture on the TC Roll of Honour. Of course, individual TCs do have their own stories to tell, and TCs producing their own narratives is also essential. The new recovery movement may inadvertently written itself into a vacuum, and there's no oxygen in isolation. And the Community of Communities Forum and the TCTC, it stands as testimony to the necessity of connecting communities together. My recommendation for the New Recovery colleagues is, if they want to see how an idea and a paradigm and services can survive, not just for a few months, but for decades on time, then look no further than the story of therapeutic communities. Thank you.